that starts with this idea that Antarctica is going to be a source of prosperity, that there are just tremendous opportunities down there.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Modern Australia was born from an age of empire. The British established a penal colony in the South Pacific, not simply out of necessity, but out of strategic ambition to extend imperial reach, secure territory, and deny their European rivals access to a rapidly expanding world. Yet, having emerged from the ambitions of empire, Australia soon began to imagine ambitions of its own. For generations, Australians looked south not with indifference, but with fascination. Antarctica was not seen merely as a frozen wasteland at the edge of the map, but as part of a wider southern world in which Australia might play a leading role. Explorers, politicians, scientists and entrepreneurs imagined a vast Australian sphere stretching from the tropics to the polar ice, an empire of the south that would place Australia not on the periphery of history, but at its centre. This southern imagination shaped everything from trade and exploration to defence policy and national identity. The sealing and whaling industries tied the Australian colonies economically to the Southern Ocean before wool had fully emerged as a driver of prosperity. Antarctic explorers were celebrated with near mythic reverence. School children commemorated Scott of the Antarctic, almost in the manner later generations would commemorate Anzac heroes. At one point, there were even proposals that Australia's capital city might be named Shackleton. And yet this story is also one of exploitation and contradiction. Penguins were industrially boiled down for oil on Macquarie Island. Strategic anxieties about foreign powers shaped Australia's claims to the Antarctic South. And over time, the language shifted from a belief that Australia had a right to Antarctica to a belief that it had a responsibility for it. Well, to discuss Australia's imperial ambitions to our south, my guest today is Rohan Howitt, who's a lecturer in environmental history at Monash University and author of The Southern Frontier. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Rohan.
Thank you so much.
Antarctica is a fascinating place. I've never been there, but I think especially as a child growing up in the 80s and 90s, we still did read those books about Scott and Shackleton and Amundsen, the race to the South Pole, and it had a kind of heroic quality, these stories. And I think as a child too, there's that curiosity about all the creatures of the Antarctic and the Arctic, the penguins, the whales, the seals, all the bird life. What is it about Antarctica that you think really captivated Australians in our early history?
It's such an interesting question because I think it starts out as something very different in that what today is a fascination with the environment itself was originally a fascination with what could be extracted from that environment. So I would argue always that Australia's first substantial export industry was whaling and sealing.
And penguining.
That comes a little bit later.
Oh, okay.
But as early as kind of the 17th...
I was quite alarmed about the penguining, by the way. I don't know why. I think I was familiar enough with the whaling and sealing. It's the idea of these poor penguins being...
It definitely is a confronting imagery. And so I think that early period of thinking about the subantarctic islands in particular as spaces of just incredible wealth. And it was a resource frontier that was just swept over so incredibly quickly. If you look at somewhere like Macquarie Island, it goes from being discovered to the seal populations essentially being wiped out in the space of less than 10 years. Wow. And that plays out across all of these subantarctic islands. And so you've got this incredible sort of economic boom that happens in the early 19th century that draws people's attention to the Southern Ocean in a way that I think it's very easy to forget just how frequent a part of life this is. That if for someone like living in Sydney or Hobart, on a daily basis, you've got ships coming back from these voyages, you've got people who have been there, and you recognise that people have made their wealth in subantarctic sealing, for example, and have then reinvested that so that your warehouses and your insurance companies and your banks and these things are products of that subantarctic wealth. And so I think that's the really foundational story of how then stories of and images of that environment start to fascinate people, that it's because of these experiences that people get to know the penguins and the ice and the bird life and the whales and all these kinds of things that continue to drive that fascination of this unknown environment.
When you're describing the idea of the opportunities, the economic opportunities of the islands to our south, it does sort of remind me of the Spanish explorers, say, going to the Americas and trying to, find all the spices and the gold and these frontiers of potential wealth and prosperity. And I guess looking back at what we know about Antarctica now, and of course we don't exploit it for, very sensible ecological reasons, but it's still hard to imagine that we thought of Antarctica or the sort of Southern Ocean as potentially providential as the Americas turned out to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the language is echoing that a phrase that comes up again and again in this story is the El Dorado of the South.
Right.
They're genuinely referring to the belief that this could be, the way of securing Australia's wealth. And there's peaks and troughs in that kind of belief, in that a lot of the time it's when Australia is facing sort of economic downturns, you then get this boost of thinking about, well, in the past, we were prosperous on the back of subantarctic whaling. So why don't we go back there? Why did we ever let that slip? And so there's kind of factors happening at home that are shaping that belief elsewhere. But it absolutely is kind of optimism and boosterism, that there's a lot of realistic things that are put aside in terms of things like, they suspect that there's large amounts of coal and gold and even radium and things like that in Antarctica that some future technology will allow us to mine. There's belief that we could have a huge kind of guano industry using penguin poo as fertilizer and importing that back without knowing how we would actually mine that and make that profitable. Even the whale species, you get these reports circulating back from people who've been to the fringes of Antarctica saying there is an unimaginable population of whales here. They're not the kind we have the technology to hunt, but one day we will be able to.
Because they were too big.
Too big. They were rorqual whales, and so it's only the late 19th century in the Arctic that explosive harpoons are developed that enable them to do that, which essentially forces the whale to float once they kill it, whereas previously it would sink and they wouldn't be able to hunt it. So a lot of the early attempts to kick off true Antarctic whaling in Australia suffer from this, that they have the technology to hunt right whales, for example, but not blue whales. And that comes much later in the 20th century.
How much of this idea that Australia could be quite a sort of large imperial territory, I think there was this idea that the Australian archipelago would stretch from Christmas Island, New Guinea, Nauru, then down to Antarctica and Norfolk and Macquarie Islands, and then Enderby Land and Heard and McDonald Islands in the west. So, I can't even imagine what this territory would encompass, but absolutely enormous. I mean, this idea, was this being pushed by London or was this being pushed by Australians in the colonies?
The exact opposite. It is coming from Australia.
Right.
And that is one of the things that I think is so interesting about this story, is that there's this constant tension in Australian history between, belief in the value of being part of a British empire, but also the belief that Australia should be the centre of its own empire, that it's kind of the new Britain. And so a lot of the language from sort of the 1860s is talking about Australia being in quite a similar position to America on the eve of the Revolution, that it's a small country now, but destined to control this enormous region. And they talk about manifest destiny. They talk about a Monroe Doctrine of our own, or a Monroe Doctrine of the South. And it's articulating this idea that for Australia's security, prosperity, its aspirations to greatness, everything they want Australia to be requires it to control this huge region beyond its borders. And there's a lot of debate about what does that look like in practice. And it's kind of like a sphere of influence idea rather than a true belief in colonial control. They are talking about
most of these islands aren't really populated with humans, are they? So
exactly. So it's about preventing someone else from taking them.
Not too much to control aside from the animals.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we've maybe downplayed that story. But somewhere like New Guinea in the 1880s, comes from this belief that Germany is about to take it. And so we have the Premier of Queensland dispatching an expedition to claim it beforehand. And that goes against everything that British policy says they're allowed to do. And so it leads to a huge dispute. And we end up with exactly the same story playing out in places like the Kerguelen Islands, far to the southwest, where again, Australia thinks that this is a priority and the British Colonial Office disagrees. And even when we get to Australia claiming the Antarctic territory in 1933, this is again a product of Australian ambitions being forestalled for a long period of time by British policy.
Right. So we often talk about Australia's prosperity coming from us riding on the sheep's back. It's from wool. And wool is I think, the most important industry until well into the middle of the 20th century. But wool was a bit of a latecomer when we think about sealing and whaling. And I'm looking here in my notes, and this is terribly ignorant of me. I didn't realise it was Captain Cook who was the first to circumnavigate Antarctica. So this was happening in the 18th century. So, these sealing and whaling industries, were they developing pretty much as soon as we had white settlement in Australia in the
exactly
late 18th century?
Yeah, so 1790s.
Yeah.
So sealing begins on the shores of Sydney. So essentially within a couple of years, people are hunting seals and fur seals along the coast. And then sealers, because it's a really easy, cheap industry to get into, in the sense that there's not a lot of capital that needs to be invested. If you can lease a ship and send some people there, it operates on a lay system, which means that you don't pay wages or anything like that. It's everyone gets a share of the profits. And so it's an incredibly easy thing for this first generation of freed convicts to turn their attention to. And that takes down, the coast of New South Wales into Bass Strait, over to New Zealand, then to these sub-Antarctic islands. And whaling starts at a kind of similar period. You have a bunch of ships bring convicts out under contract from the British government, then go and hunt whales to get whale oil as a cargo to take back so that they can profit from both directions of the voyage. And then, by the early 19th century, you have the start of Sydney and Hobart as whaling ports and local whaling industries. And in many cases, people who had made their profits out of sealing turn to whaling, and then, that creates so much of the sort of financial infrastructure of that early period of colonial development that enables people to then start investing in things like pastoral industries. So they're all really deeply connected, and this idea of a sub-Antarctic hinterland is so crucial to understanding that early colonial development.
It's really hard to kind of imagine Australia as this sort of great whaling country. But I originally come from South Australia, and there's a town called Victor Harbour that has a whole museum devoted to the whaling history, and you can learn about the whalers. There's even a hotel called the Whalers Inn, still stands to this day, and a statue there. So, this was a big part of our, obviously, late 18th, but that 19th century history. How quickly, though, did it go bad? Did we just sort of run out of these mammals, the mega fauna?
Remarkably quickly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things going on. It's a whole fascinating story that I won't go too deeply into, but there's the phenomenon of definitely overhunting is a big part of the story, but also the whales get much better at outsmarting the whalers.
Oh, really? So they're
adapting.
Sentient, aren't they?
And it's a really interesting story that, for a long time we thought it was just a case of, we hunted too many whales, then there weren't the populations. But what that doesn't explain is that the catch rate goes down, so that the percentage of whales caught compared to the percentage of attempts to hunt a whale just absolutely plummets over the course of about the first 40 years of the 19th century. So that by the 1840s, not only are we hunting fewer whales in total, but the percentage of successful whale hunts has just dropped because whales are developing new strategies to avoid being hunted. They're stopping and they're plunge diving and they're doing all sorts of things that they didn't used to do. So there's some really interesting, very recent research on exactly that. So there's a lot going on that means that by the middle of the 19th century, that whaling boom is well and truly over. And the colonies were kind of starting to enter a bit of an economic depression that obviously, in the 50s, most colonies come out of that on the back of gold, and that transforms everything. But then there's places like Tasmania that don't have a gold rush in the 1850s, and feel very left behind, and they're kind of hemorrhaging colonists to other colonies, to the goldfields, and they're the ones who are really championing the idea of, well, we just need to go further south. Go to Antarctica. We know there are whales there. We've heard the stories. That's how we're going to save Tasmania's sort of economic future.
And how did they go?
Terribly. They managed to convince one visiting whale.
There are a lot of whales in Antarctica.
There are a lot of whales, yes. Yeah. And what they discovered was
that
they were just
smart ones, are they?
Very smart, but also they were the wrong type for them to hunt. So they came with equipment for hunting specific types of whales, like right whales or sperm whales, and then discovered that the whales in Antarctica were rorquals, the things like fin whales and blue whales, that they just could not, they didn't have the technology to hunt them successfully.
And so because they're too big.
Too big,
right.
Too big, and they sink.
And they sink, yeah. And when the waters are several hundred metres deep,
that's a problem.
Possibly 1,000, yes, that's going to be a bit of a problem. But now, whale oil was highly valued for many uses. Mm-hmm. This was a time when the petroleum industry wasn't obviously nearly as developed as it is today. So what would you use whale oil for?
All sorts of things. Lighting is the really famous one, and you'd have different types of whales producing different grades of oil for lamps and things like that. But one of the most prominent uses is rope making. So if you think of all the ropes of all the ships and things in the world, there's a process called hatcheling that is a core part of rope making, and it requires whale oil to be done well. And, there are ways to try and do it with cod oil, and in Australia and New Zealand, there was an attempt to do it with penguin oil, but that's one of the key uses.
Is this to make it like water resistant?
It's part of preparing the fibres to be spun into rope, is that they need to be impregnated with this oil, and whale oil was the preferred source in kind of the British world. Yeah, and there's also things like it was widely used in tanneries for tanning leather. It's used as a lubricant for different kind of industrial purposes. So even early like textiles machinery is using whale oil as a lubricant. And a little bit later on, in kind of the late 19th century, they start experimenting with hydrogenation, which is the process for turning it into a sort of odourless, colourless substance to be used to make margarine or soap. And that's what kicks off the recovery of the whaling industry around the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, so as soon as electricity is developed, it's not
you don't need it for lighting.
They've
They've displaced it for tanneries and for rope making and things like that. But the one that revitalises the demand for it is margarine and soap.
And there was a perfume, wasn't there, that was derived from whales and was really, really highly valued. It was it ambergris?
Ambergris, yep, yeah. Which comes from sperm whales specifically. But yeah, there's so many different things, even used in explosives in the First World War. It was used as a treatment for trench foot in the First World War to prevent your feet getting waterlogged. You slather them in whale oil. It constantly crops up. Because it was so widely available, it was something that was available for people to experiment with. And so if you have a theory, people were trying whale oil for it. It even occasionally had medicinal uses as well as, the same way we would use cod liver oil today. You could have people having whale oil as a consumable.
The book Moby Dick, which I have to admit I have never read, but I mean this idea of a whale that is, unbeatable, is this sort of linked to this idea that they were really smart, outwitting humans, and then of course there was human tragedy in the hunting of whales too, and boats would sink because of the kind of battle with the whale.
Yeah, there's all sorts of true stories behind that, absolutely. And in that kind of open boat whaling era of the 19th century, you see that all the time, that it's not an even fight, but it's certainly more even than what changes around the turn of the 20th century when we switch to what we would call industrial whaling, where it's using steamships and explosive harpoons and huge shore-based factories in places like South Georgia in the subantarctic. And that lays a platform for a new wave of thinking about, in an Australian context, well, why do we want Antarctica? Well, we can control this land, we can control the shore stations, which enables us to control this new kind of whaling industry where the numbers involved are just unimaginable.
So the Tasmanians don't have a gold rush. They don't have gold. They're losing settlers or convicts to the mainland. They're hoping that Antarctica will offer, it's the El Dorado of whaling, sealing and penguining, as we'll discuss. But the whales are way too big. But this sort of idea of industrial scale whaling that can be done from the shore. How does that, what do they harpoon a whale and kind of drag it into the shore?
Yeah.
As it's swimming past?
So this is a system that gets set up in sort of 1880s, 1890s northern Norway and then extends into places like Greenland. It does involve, you have your station, which is using very large-scale steam-powered machinery, machines known as digesters, to produce the blood and blubber and meat and steam it into releasing the oil. And so they will send out these steam ships that are really fast, really manoeuvrable, that will hunt the whales, drag them back, and then they're processed on shore. So instead of it all being done by one crew at sea, on voyages of 3-4 years at times in the 19th century, you have instead, it's a waged labour job, and it's a totally different kind of world.
So it's really a factory.
It is a factory,
It's an incredible amount of waste then if they're boiling down the meat, the blubber, skins, and they're not using that. They're just trying to get the oil, extract the oil from all this part of the whale.
Yeah, and there's these fascinating accounts of people sailing into these whaling factories in somewhere like South Georgia and just going past a bay where just the entire shoreline is littered with whale carcasses that haven't been used. There's literally just hundreds of whale carcasses in various states of decomposition lying the shores.
So they were catching more than they could process.
Yeah. And so they would just take the oiliest, best oil-producing parts and, on a slow season they would process everything because they would make things like blood and bone fertilizer out of it and, take meat and sell it for things like pet food or something like that. But when the going was good, they would take far more than they needed, just take the oil that was most valuable. And so this is happening in other parts of the sub-Antarctic, and Australians are looking very enviously at this, being like, well, why don't we have stations there? And so it's a real kind of source of jealousy and desire to get in on the action.
So, yes, who are the people in South Georgia? It's the South Americans are encroaching in the Antarctic islands? And
mainly British licensed companies. So Britain claims it as part of the Falkland Islands.
So the South Americans or the Americans, Spanish, they're not...
America, not really. There's one Argentine company operating over there. There's a Chilean company a bit further south. But it's mainly British and Norwegian companies under license from the British government. And then from about the 1920s, they start realising they don't need the factories anymore. And so they start setting up floating factories on ships and going into international waters and doing it outside of licensing. And this is something that really panics a lot of Australians who are interested in the Antarctic into saying, well, they can just sail into our waters and take our whales. And there's a real kind of belief, well, we need to control this properly and have the Australian Antarctic Territory as a legally protected Australian territory so that we can be the ones to profit from these whales, because otherwise we're vulnerable to losing our inheritance.
Even though the British sailors, presumably, or British factories, we're part of the British Empire then, so we're all fighting or prospering under the same flag, so to speak. So, but there was still a sense that they were outsiders and not of the Australian colony.
Yeah, and a lot of the fact is that even the British companies were employing Norwegian crews to do it, and so there was a real kind of fear that they were still outsiders, whereas there were all of these different proposals for how they could do genuinely Australian companies to prosecute the whaling industry from an Australian base using just our own capital, our own workers, and do something that would sort of ensure the prosperity of the Commonwealth. It was a really popular idea.
Before we get on to the way Australians conceived of Antarctica really as our territory, and we had a right to it as the nearest continent to the southern continent, I do want to ask you about penguining. This is quite startling, and I must say I wasn't really aware of the penguin industry. Tell me about how we moved from seals to whales to penguins.
Yeah.
I guess they were nice and easy to catch.
There is an element of that.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of attempts after there's that early sort of whaling and sealing boom of the 19th century that these islands have been sort of denuded of their obvious resources. In many cases, whole species of fur seals have been wiped out, whole breeding rookeries have been wiped out. And so there's a sense of, well, what can we do with these islands now? And there's some efforts at things like pastoral colonies, that we can land sheep on there and turn it into a farming settlement. There's attempts to work out if mining is viable. And one of the ideas that gets floated by one particular entrepreneur, a guy in Invercargill in New Zealand called Joseph Hatch, is that Macquarie Island has all of these penguins. He'd seen them when he migrated from Britain. He'd gone kind of within sight of Macquarie Island and seen all these penguins and decided that this was the secret, that in the past people had occasionally supplemented their seal and whale oil cargoes with penguins. So he said, well, why don't we just hunt penguins specifically? And so in 1889, he starts experimenting with that on Macquarie Island, has various disputes with the New Zealand government that is very opposed to him doing this.
And why was that? They didn't like the thought of it? Or
so New Zealand was quite far ahead of Australia when it came to conservation legislation in the subantarctic. And so they had really strict restrictions on fur sealing and sealing in general. So there's fur sealing, but there's also elephant seals that are used to produce oil. And they were worried that letting someone hunt penguins on Macquarie Island, he could also just go to all these other islands that no one's really monitoring and pretend that it's penguin oil but actually get New Zealand seal oil and violate the legislation. So he relocates to Tasmania and starts doing it under license from the Tasmanian government. And it's never a hugely profitable industry, mainly because Macquarie Island is not the place to be trying to anchor a ship. There's no safe harbours at all. And so he loses 3 ships in 20 years attempting to do this, and there's all sorts of disasters. People getting left behind and washed off the ships. They lose cargoes trying to load the ships and so on. So it's really difficult because of the environment, but they are kind of generating a profit out of slaughtering penguins and producing this oil, which he's then marketing because it's not an established commodity. So he's marketing it as an alternative for rope making, for tanneries. He uses it to manufacture a sheep and cattle dip that is used to kill ticks. But when there was finally a review done on the efficacy of it, they found that his sheep dip both killed the sheep and the ticks. Right. So that ruined that industry, but he sells it as medicine. He gives out tins of free samples along with lectures where he shows pictures of the industry in action. He does a special children's lecture promoting his industry, talking about, how we can show the children how we slaughtered the penguins and put them into these steam digesters and then gives them tins of oil. Was that a bestseller?
I can't imagine that being.
It's a different world.
Yeah. So at one point, a single company on Macquarie Island was processing 3,500 penguins a day during the summer oiling system. Yeah, that's a lot of penguins.
It's a lot of penguins. And what's really remarkable is that the penguin population still grew over this period. So it attracted a lot of opposition, this industry, because it was so obviously confronting. And there was a lot of allegations of cruelty and that it was going to lead to the extinction of the penguins. And the penguins they targeted were royal penguins who are only found on Macquarie Island. So there was clearly this real threat to them. But all the evidence suggests that actually the population did continue to increase because the way they did it was they would wait till the penguins go out to feed and swim, then build a fence to prevent them from going back up to their rookeries, and they'd cut a hole in it that the skinny penguins could get through, and the oily, larger penguins were stuck on the beach, and then those are the ones they would hunt.
All right, so the skinny penguins continued to breed. And
so it meant that they essentially only targeted the younger, larger male penguins, that sort of inadvertently they did something that wasn't totally upending the population dynamics. It was kind of the exact opposite to the sealing industry, where they made it through their practices so difficult to be sustainable. So they accidentally created this objectively awful yet kind of sustainable penguin oil industry on Macquarie Island.
The fact that it actually was, in terms of sustainability, just fine, was obviously not the reason that caused its demise. Why did they stop penguining? I have here a quote from the photographer, very, very famous photographer, Frank Hurley, who spoke out against this industry, saying, "I want now to tell you something of the frightful and wanton savagery which is perpetrated there," in Macquarie Island, obviously.
Yeah, so Hurley was part of this very early, very interesting sort of international conservation campaign, and that's really what ends this industry, is it becomes unviable for the Tasmanian government to continue to license it because it's so unpopular, because you have people like Douglas Mawson and Frank Hurley, as well as internationally people like H.G. Wells getting involved in this, and they will do lectures. They would show the video footage of penguins waddling up the beach at Macquarie Island, and they're objectively cute. Mawson in his lectures would refer to them as, little gentlemen in tuxedos who have dined well but unwisely because they're so portly in their movements. So they're so cute. But juxtaposing that with this imagery of smashing them with a club and packing them into digesters to produce oil that isn't really needed means that it just became unviable, and it kind of loses a public relations battle, which is to essentially draw the line at penguins, because these aren't people complaining that animals should not be slaughtered for industrial use. They're almost all in favour of whaling. Most of them are in favour of sealing. Mawson even suggests that to fund the cost of making Macquarie Island a sanctuary for penguins, we should introduce foxes to have a fox farm so that we can sell fur to subsidise the cost of having a caretaker to look after the penguins. Didn't happen. Didn't happen.
Thank goodness.
But it is a really useful reminder, I think, of the fact that it's not conservation in the sense of all animals should be protected. It's penguins are special, and that's
cute.
Where we draw the lines. And I think that is a big part of it. They're a really charismatic species.
Yeah. Well, and I guess also the oil could easily be
very easily replaced
with a different type of oil. So in the end, it was not a necessary industry. We really, until the Antarctic Treaty, where it was sort of all settled, so to speak, or,
ish.
At least it's sort of in aspic holding. We really thought of Antarctica for quite some time as our territory. It's like we had a right to it. We declared I think over 40% of Antarctica.
42%.
As Australia. So why did we think we had a right to it?
It's a really complex story to get to that point, I think, that it starts with this idea that Antarctica is going to be a source of prosperity, that there are just tremendous opportunities down there. And that obviously goes back to that early 19th century memories of past prosperity and projections of future greatness. But in the middle of the 19th century, you start to get people talking more and more about, because Australia is neighbours with Antarctica, our proximity means that we have a special relationship with it and a right to be the ones who will benefit from exploring and exploiting Antarctica. And so that early sort of thinking about proximity, bestowing specific rights, becomes incredibly influential. And it fuses in the second half of the 19th century with this idea about an Australian sphere of influence, that, well, this is one frontier of it, but so is the Southwest Indian Ocean, so is the Pacific, that these are all places that Australia has a right to be, if not controlling it directly, to at least prevent anyone else from controlling them, for security, for things like development, and for new kinds of industries. And so there's this really interesting sort of transition that takes place in the 1870s when there's an international campaign to observe the transit of Venus from as many different places as possible around the world, because you can get all kinds of useful astronomical information from doing that. And it's realised in Victoria that no one is going to Antarctica. And this is like a crime against science. This happens so rarely that we need to be the ones to step up, and we're going to go on an expedition to Proclamation Island off the coast of Victorialand in Antarctica, and we are going to do this expedition. We'll leave in about 6 months. And it's totally unrealistic, but it gets debated throughout the press. It becomes a huge issue in Victorian Parliament. The Premier is excoriated for refusing to fund this expedition, and it really lays a foundation for this idea that Australians are going to benefit the most from this. We have a responsibility as the people lying closest to this part of the world, that this is our duty to explore. And that really sets the foundation for how Australians then continue talking about it, that it's Australia's duty, but also Australia's responsibility and obligation, and that all of these things start to bestow a kind of natural right to control this territory.
But then there's also this sort of, I guess, race to explore Antarctica and to claim parts of it as territory. I mean, I think France claims some, the United States, Britain, obviously. I think, does Norway claim a part? I mean, it was a bit of a free-for-all at some point. Tell me about how that was taken in Australia and how we responded.
Yeah, so Australians do get very freaked out at different times by the idea that other countries are going to beat them to it. France is the long-running rival in this regard, and it starts with the sub-Antarctic islands, because there's this string of islands that are on the Anglo-Australian sailing routes that in all these maps appear in British pink. And it was just assumed, okay, they may not be Australian islands, but they're British, everything's fine. until the 1880s.
Pink meant British, though.
Pink meant British, yes.
Pink meant British, yeah.
British Empire was always pink on Australian maps. And
what were we? Were we dark pink? Or
we were also pink. We were just pink. Just regular old pink.
Oh, just pink.
Yeah. And then, France suddenly turns up and claims all these islands and says no one ever actually claimed sovereignty over these. It was just assumed that they were British. And
do they still have French names to this day?
Yeah, so they were originally kind of discovered by French explorers, and it's just no one had ever followed up on what they were. So it's the Kerguelen Islands, the Crozet Islands, all these ones in the very far southern Indian Ocean or northern Southern Ocean to the southwest of WA that occasionally appear on like maps of our search and rescue zone and things like that. They don't really figure much in the consciousness now, but at the time.
Is this where the Malaysian airline
It is exactly there.
That's in that neck of the woods.
Yes, so that was the point on the map where suddenly everyone kind of was seeing Kerguelen again. Yeah. But it was like a landmark on the migration routes in the past and things like that. And so there was real kind of concern about what would happen, that if we can lose that, if Germany can claim New Guinea or parts of Samoa, we've got these other countries in the Australian sphere of influence, so we need to be more aggressive. And so there's real kind of lobbying for an Australian expedition to go and claim these territories, or at the very least to support British expeditions to do exactly that. And that's kind of how it starts, that someone like Shackleton gets supported by the Australian government to go and do these things that will benefit Australia.
I found that interesting that we basically facilitated the British expeditions rather than our own. I mean, we had Douglas Mawson, our own explorer, but yeah, why was that? Was it just because we didn't have the financial capacity or the ability to project power?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the technical capacity as well, that there's just far less firms available to provide the equipment they need or the knowledge to be able to do these things, but also that it was just really expensive. And a lot of the attempts to start an Australian expedition are in the late 1880s, early 1890s, when the colonies are going through an economic depression. They just don't have the capital available. They came really close with a joint Australian-Swedish expedition in the 1890s, a very unlikely partnership. And there was an attempt to kind of sponsor some whalers to do some exploration on Australia's behalf. But it very quickly became apparent that actually certain British expeditions or even non-British ones could facilitate Australian interests. And so you have people like Carsten Borchgrevink, people like Ernest Shackleton, who are able to articulate how their goals, which are to reach the South Pole, to make these discoveries, will also support those of Australia. And so Shackleton recruits all these Australians like Douglas Mawson and Edgeworth David especially to join him to go and do science that will benefit the Australian university systems. He will hand over all his data, and his reports were all written in Australia. He would do meteorological research that would help to improve Australian forecasting of weather with all its benefits for agriculture. They would make discoveries and surveys of things like coalfields and searching for evidence of resources that Australians could benefit from. And so Australia gives Shackleton the money he needed for his very scrappy, privately funded first expedition in 1907. They give him £5,000 when no one's even sure if the Commonwealth government can do that. It was very legally dubious. But they just forced it through on like the last day of Parliament to say, we're just giving this money to Shackleton.
Yeah, someone tried to. No one would blink an eyelid.
Exactly. Yeah. But this was, still the era of a very small Commonwealth government.
Sure.
And they just said, we're doing it. The one guy who tried to say no, they just said, shame, sit down. And he's like, okay, fine. And they just gave him the money.
So we apparently even considered naming Canberra Shackleton. I mean, what?
Very briefly.
Right.
Very briefly. So when Shackleton came back in 1909, he hadn't actually reached the South Pole. He made it to 97 geographical miles away.
Brutal, isn't it?
Very close. And Mawson and David had made it to the South Magnetic Pole and had climbed Mount Erebus for the first time. And so there were these kind of big headline achievements, and these managed to persuade people in Australia that this was just like the most incredible success. And so when Shackleton's ship comes back, they moor it in Sydney at a very quiet anchorage on the north side of the harbour, but they can't get anything done because they have ferries being leased to just go round and round the ship just to go and see it. And so to get a little bit of peace, Shackleton agrees to open up the ship to inspection for the public. And it's something like 3.5% of the population of Sydney goes and visits the Nimrod, the ship, when it's opened up, and they just destroy it because people are trying to get souvenirs. And so they cut up the rigging, they cut up the sails. Someone steals a sledge dog puppy that was meant to be given to the Queen.
Oh, no.
One of the sailors makes a killing out of just picking up rocks from Circular Quay and then selling them as authentic Erebus lava. All sorts of things of this just incredible interest. And there's sold-out lectures. They're usually regarded as, at the time, in 1909, the most popular lectures ever presented in Australia by people like Shackleton. People are mobbed in the streets. It's genuinely kind of Shackleton mania. The level of enthusiasm was incredible. And in that moment, there was a discussion of, well, why don't we name our future capital city after the great man of the age? And that does die down, but, it's a really good reminder of, people were this enthusiastic about Antarctica and Shackleton, and it was a genuine, popular culture moment.
And because he was British, there was a sense that he was one of their own, even if he wasn't Australian. The fact that a Munson makes it to the geographic South Pole first, is that a sort of moment of national tragedy for Australians in 1911?
Not
really. No, they just think it's great it was done.
That it was done.
But they're devastated that Scott died. Of course, the other, that is a very, very sad story, and I do remember learning about that at school. And he was sort of brutally close, wasn't he, to supplies or to safety. And, heartbreaking.
Yes, and that's the tragic counterpart to the Shackleton story. But it is, again, treated because he, again, was very well funded by the Australian government, had a bunch of Australian explorers in his party, and it was seen as he was doing something that would benefit Australia by exploring Antarctica and opening up this place for development and future work. And so it was really interpreted as an Australian tragedy as well, both in really odd ways, where it's stuff like, well, the cross that they made to memorialise Scott was made of Australian hardwood, and this should be a source of Australian pride, through to we need to give money to support the families of the explorers who died. And so they raise over £10,000 in Australia through mass public donation campaigns and things like that. So it's a really disproportionate contribution, and this feeling of grief that we need to support someone who was going to be doing something that was so beneficial to Australia.
Yeah. We shift our thinking on Antarctica from it, we're entitled to it. It's our right to we are responsible for it. And this sort of idea that there is a conservation aspect to our responsibility to Antarctica. What marks this shift?
It's one of those ideas that I think is always kind of there, and it's just the meaning of responsibility starts to shift. In that early responsibility is, we have a responsibility to do the work of exploration, to unlock its secrets, to map this place, to understand how it relates to the weather of the Southern Hemisphere and all these kind of big questions, that's an Australian obligation and duty. To then this increasing belief during that heroic age of people like Scott, Mawson, Shackleton himself on his second expedition, who kind of run into trouble in Antarctica. This belief that, well, we have a responsibility to support those people. And that's why you get these extreme fundraising campaigns to support the families of explorers who died, but also to support expeditions like searching for Shackleton's party in 1914 and things like that. And that only starts to shift to the idea that we have a responsibility to preserve it, sort of in the 20s and 30s when they're talking about whaling and the threat posed by Norwegian whaling to the populations of Antarctic animals. And again, it's in very economic terms. Part of the discussions in Parliament when they're accepting the Australian Antarctic Territory as a Commonwealth territory is, well, we have to do this because otherwise the whales will be wiped out. But this way we can manage them so that they'll always be a productive source of wealth for Australia, and we can pass this inheritance down to future generations of Australians.
When did we formally stop whaling?
In Australia?
Yeah, or just in general?
In general? Late 70s.
Oh, okay.
Possibly even early 80s.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. We're past my time period here, but
No.
It's very late.
But so we finally in 1933 claim 42% of the Antarctic continent after spending 2 decades lobbying the British to transfer their claims onto this one Australian consolidated one. I mean, this was just considered an obvious decision, or was it contested? I mean, certainly other countries had a different view.
Yeah. So throughout the 1920s, there's this series of imperial conferences where the British dominions get together and thrash out a policy on the Antarctic, which is the idea that Australia should have the biggest sector, but New Zealand should have a sector, and Britain would control the rest through the Falkland Islands, which it was using as kind of its little claim to be essentially on the verges of Antarctica. And that's the kind of agreement that they reach. But Australia wants to claim the Antarctic territory immediately. The British policy is to go very slowly, make sure the sovereignty claims are ironclad. And it starts out by declaring the New Zealand claim, the Ross dependency, which panics France to then claim Adelie land, which is that little segment within the Australian Antarctic territory. If you've seen it on a map, there's a little slice missing. That's Adelie land because Australia was a bit slow to actually have its claim made. And the policy eventually is, well, you need to go back there and revisit all these places and raise the flag and perform proper proclamation ceremonies. So they send Mawson back again.
And he makes all these proclamations along the coast, doesn't he?
In very odd ways, including in one case they couldn't land, so he goes up in an airplane and drops a flag and a proclamation over the side. He is accused of falsifying his logbooks to say he got there before some Norwegians that were also trying to do it. It's a very controversial expedition that runs in 1929 to 1931 that seems like a bit of a waste of taxpayer money at a time when it would be quite useful for other purposes in the context of the Depression. But they do it, and they manage to stitch together all of these different little claims to satisfy kind of the lawyers and say, yes, we have a legitimate claim, and then that is created by a British Order in Council, which then by an Act of Parliament in Australia creates the Antarctic Territory in 1933.
We had these imperial ambitions to this sort of Southern Empire, but when did they peter out? Because we certainly can't imagine having them these days. And even the fact that there's Australian Antarctic territory, it would play into the minds, I think, of people in Tasmania a lot because that's where our base is, a shipping base to go down and visit Antarctica. But it's not something that Australians, I think very closely about or see it as an intrinsic part of their identity.
Definitely not. I think there's lots of little reminders. So when there were tariffs charged on the Heard and McDonald Islands last year, for example, that was a little reminder of, hang on, why do we control the Heard and McDonald Islands?
The Trump tariffs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why do we control 42% of the Australian Antarctic territory? Why do we still control Christmas Island? And that one obviously is a bit more contemporary and relevant, but also why did we end up with the Cocos-Keeling Islands? Why do we still have these connections with Nauru, with Papua New Guinea? And these are all legacies of that imperial impetus, which continues after the Second World War. Like we are still acquiring places like Christmas Island and the Heard and McDonald's in the 40s. But really, I think empire falls out of favour as a form of political organisation for the modern world in the 50s and 60s, to the point that by the 70s, the fact that Australia still had territories was seen as a bit of an embarrassment.
Yeah. Well, Papua New Guinea only became independent in 1975, didn't it? We had the 50th anniversary of that last year.
And, Whitlam campaigned on the promise of it's demeaning to Australians to be in this position as colonisers. And so there was a real sense that this is a bit of an awkward embarrassment that we don't really talk about anymore, but we've still got all these territories that, they're not going to become independent. They're uninhabited islands and things like that. But it's interesting that even with the Antarctic Treaty, we are still going into those negotiations in the 50s saying that, well, sovereignty is non-negotiable. That's not something we can give up. And that's a big part of why the treaty adopts this idiosyncratic kind of frozen sovereignty claims formula, is because Australia in particular refused to back down from its sovereignty claim. And so there's still lingering elements of it into the 50s, even as the idea of an Australian empire has been going from something of, well, this is how any state that wants to be great will organise itself, to, well, this is an embarrassment. That transition is happening in the 50s and 60s, but we're still seeing legacies of it.
And I think because we gave up the possibility of extracting, minerals and iron ore or whatever oil we were going to extract from Antarctica, there's a sort of sense that what is the real point of this claim? There are strategic elements, of course, and that's very pertinent, I'm sure, but it is a particularly inhospitable place. So despite the strategic benefits of having this territory, is there very much we can do?
I mean, I think we do start to see that responsibility that we were talking about shift into this kind of idea of almost custodianship, sort of in the 1980s, when Australia shifts very abruptly from supporting a system of regulations for experimental mining in Antarctica to resolutely opposing it and attempting to get a new treaty agreed called the Madrid Protocol that says that, Antarctica is a continent reserved for peace and science. And that shift in language means that we increasingly from the 80s talk about ourselves as sort of a custodian of Antarctica for future generations, in the same way we would talk about sort of national parks domestically, that it's a protection for future generations. At the same time as we still have that sovereignty claim, that the official Antarctic plan from 2016 is the most recent one, updated a few years ago, still says, we have these two commitments. We are the custodians of Antarctica, but we are also a sovereign entity there. And so it's this kind of dual way of thinking that continues into the present. And the custodianship has become more prominent over time, but both angles are still there.
A fascinating part of our history, Rohan. Thank you so much for coming on Afternoon Light to discuss it.
Thanks so much for having me.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.